listening to Sit Down right here with Russ Latino. Joining us now is Dr. Saad, professor, public intellectual, author of several best-selling books, The Parasitic Mind, a new book that's coming out, I think, in just a couple of weeks, Suicidal Empathy, that is already a bestseller, as I understand it. Welcome to the Sit Down.
Great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So you started in evolutionary psychology, understanding human behavior, but have very much grown into a public figure, a public commentator on human behavior. What was that transition like from point A to point B?
You know, I've always loved publishing academic papers. This is how we advance knowledge, irrespective of which discipline we're working in. But I grew a bit impatient with the speed at which information flows within academic settings, right? If you publish a academic paper and it is highly successful, that means that probably you'll get 100 citations in 10 years. Well, 100 citations means that, 100 other academics have cited that work maybe in a decade. Well, I can get on a show, Joe Rogan, and I can have 20 million people consuming that knowledge. So I view my job as a academic as one that is twofold. I have to create knowledge, but then I have to disseminate knowledge, and all bets are off when it comes to disseminating knowledge. So here I'm a bit different than many of my colleagues who've always felt comfortable only operating within the ecosystem that they're familiar with. I'd like to say that I was certainly one of the first ones to appreciate these types of interactions. So thank you for having me on.
Yeah, no, it's resonant with me. I worked for a little while for an advocacy organization, this national advocacy organization that had a 9-figure a year budget, and part of what I managed were university center investments. And I can remember having internal conversations, Dr. Saad, about just what you described, which is like, it's wonderful that we're investing in university centers, but Tucker Carlson has 3 million people watching him a night, or Joe Rogan has 20 to 25 million people. So as a matter of scale, the message is not getting to where it needs to be if you want to really effectuate public change.
Exactly right. Now, I'll tell you a quick story that I first recounted in The Parasitic Mind in Chapter 1. Back in 2017, I had been invited to Stanford Business School. I mean, that would certainly be one of the meccas of academia. And I was there to speak exactly at when you kindly introduced me on my evolutionary psychology work. The night before, as often happens in these academic visits, the host who was tasked with, keeping me company, took me out to dinner. And as we were sitting for dinner, he looked at me and said, "Oh, I didn't know that you're someone who goes on Joe Rogan very often, that you're friends with him." I said, "Yeah, I've been going on for many years." And so he, with an air of haughty disdain, he says, "Yeah, well, we don't condone that at Stanford." I said, "You don't condone what at Stanford?" He goes, "Well, we don't do research so that it could be sexy enough so that we could then talk about it on Joe Rogan." I said, "Well, I don't do the research so I can appear on Joe Rogan either. But if I'm doing research that is interesting to the public, ultimately the public is the taxpayer that pays our salaries, then surely I'm going to take that opportunity. I'd rather go on Joe Rogan," and these are the exact words I said, "than have someone publish a paper that will be read by your mom, your wife, the editor, and 2 reviewers." He apparently didn't like that answer, but that's the truth.
Yeah, there's a great deal of elitism and ivory tower sort of thought process that goes into that there. I am curious. You moved from Lebanon originally in your younger life, and then to Canada, and now you're in Mississippi at some level, working with the University of Mississippi Declaration of Independence Center. How does a Lebanese Canadian end up in Mississippi?
Well, the incredible thing, maybe this is the first time that the story is being told in a public setting. I was once tweeting something, maybe the Saads need to move. I don't remember the exact timbre of what I was saying. And I just happened to notice a response from a, pretty well-connected gentleman from Mississippi saying, well, something to the effect of, well, we'd love to have you in Mississippi. Let me know if this is something that interests you. Now, it was unbelievably fortuitous that I had even hung around long enough to notice that reply, because oftentimes, when you have a large platform, I mean, you're going to get millions of replies. You don't see most of them. And so I actually replied to the gentleman and said, well, please send me an email. Very shortly thereafter, he sends me an email, says, do you mind if I connect you with somebody at the Declaration of Independence Center, who happened to be Stephen Skaltetti, whom you just had a chat with, and Rankin Sherling. Within a week or two, we held a Zoom meeting, and shortly thereafter, we were talking about how this guy could move to Mississippi, and it happened. Sometimes life is magical that way.
We're hospitable and persuasive, is what I
You
hear.
are, you are. I'll tell you another very quick story before you go on. We are a storytelling animal, so oftentimes it is these stories that resonate the most with people. Last year, I was being courted by several universities, some of which at the time were laying a lot of money at me. And so when I had gone down to visit Mississippi for the first time and visit, Rankin and Stephen and the rest of the gang at Ole Miss, when I returned, I told my wife, I said, I think Mississippi is now number one on our to-go list. She goes, are you sure? Here's how much they're going to offer you. Here's how much this other school is going to offer you. Are you sure you want to be there? And then, believe me, I was able to convince her, because earlier in October, the whole family came down. They saw the magic of the place. They now understand why we belong there.
Now, I don't want to sound like too much of a homer, but Oxford is a special place. It's God's country, so we're glad to have you there. I'll tell
Thank
you
you.
what drew me to your work and your commentary originally, and I've been out of college now longer than I care to admit, about 23 years. But when I was in college, these concepts of moral relativism, of postmodernism, were very much the hubbub amongst college professors, right? And the thought process was very much so, all cultures are equally valid. There are no real truths. Everybody can define for themselves what is moral and immoral. And it always struck me as a logically bankrupt set of thought processes that were at some level rooted in a really naive view of human nature, right? That what divides us from my perspective is that there are people who believe that human nature is flawed and subject to evil, and there are people who look at human nature as being perfectible, and because of that, they say, well, all cultures are equally valid because they can all arrive at that point of perfection. I'm curious if that thought process resonates at all with you. I think it does based on the writing that I've read from you.
Right. So in the parasitic mind, I basically argue that in the same way that many animals, including humans, can be parasitized by a wide range of parasites. For example, a tapeworm can parasitize your intestinal tract, but a neuroparasite is one that needs to end up in your brain, altering your neuronal circuitry to suit its interest. So, for example, a wood cricket abhors water. It wants nothing to do with water. But when it is parasitized by a hairworm, the hairworm needs the wood cricket to jump, happily commit suicide into water, because then the parasite can complete its reproductive cycle. So that was my epiphany. I then said, aha, I'm going to use this mechanism, this framework, to argue that human beings can suffer from ideological parasites, postmodernism, cultural relativism, social constructivism. But I would add a slight twist to what you were saying regarding the genesis of a lot of these idea parasites. I think that all of those parasitic ideas start out with a noble objective. And then, in the service of that noble objective, if you need to murder truth, so be it. So, for example, equity feminism is the idea that men and women should be treated equally under the law. Based on that very narrow definition of feminism, you and I would probably put up our hands and say, yeah, yeah, sign me up. I'm an equity feminist. Radical feminists come along and say, well, wait a minute. In order for us to effect quicker change in squashing the patriarchy, let's promulgate the idea that there are no innate sex differences. All sex differences are due to social construction, because then that lays the field for us to be able to impose our feminist utopia. So in the service of their ultimate objective, if they happen to destroy reality, so be it. So I think each of those parasitic ideas free us from the pesky shackles of reality.
What you're saying makes me think of sort of my faith tradition in Christianity, which is there was a moment in the New Testament where James and John essentially want to call fire down on a village that is acting as apostates act. And Jesus instructs them that you have to worship in both truth and love. And it strikes me that we err both directions. There are some people who want to call down fire and show no empathy at all towards other people. And then there are other people who have this very sort of milquetoast, weak version of love in mind, where there is no correction, even if the thing that the person is doing ultimately harms that person. That's the essence of suicidal empathy, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to set it up. So let me give my narrative for how parasitic mind follows or precedes suicidal empathy. We are both a thinking and feeling creature. So it's wrong to say, it's reason and not emotion. We've both evolved a cognitive system and an affective system. Parasitic mind explains what happens to a human being when their cognitive system is parasitized. But in order for me to completely own your ability to think, I have to then hijack your affective system. That's where suicidal empathy comes in. And let me explain the theoretical framework of how I came up with this idea. We know from evolutionary theory that many psychiatric disorders are the misfiring of an otherwise adaptive process. And I know it's a mouthful, so let me break it down. So take, for example, OCD. Let's say you have germ contamination fear, right? The person who suffers from that form of OCD is stuck in an infinite loop in their bathroom, washing their hands in scalding hot water until their skin is falling off. But that mechanism is actually rooted in an evolutionarily appropriate process if it is done within well-modulated regions. So let's say I have the pleasure, Russ, of meeting you in Oxford soon. And I notice that prior to you coming up to me, you're incessantly sneezing into your hands. Therefore, you seem to have a cold. Well, I will discreetly, so that I don't offend you, after I've shaken your hand, I'll head off into the bathroom and wash my hands. Therefore, scanning the environment for environmental threats makes perfect evolutionary sense. The problem with some of these psychiatric disorders is that they misfire, they become hyperactive, right? That's exactly the principle with suicidal empathy. Empathy itself is a perfectly relevant evolutionary virtue because we're a social species. In order for you and I to have a meaningful interaction, I need to put myself in your mind and vice versa. So it's perfectly reasonable to be empathetic. I want to have a spouse who's empathetic. I want my physician to be empathetic. So this is not an attack on empathy, full stop. It's an attack on dysregulated empathy, hyperactive empathy that is invoked in the wrong situations and towards the wrong targets. That results in what I call civilizational seppuku. Seppuku was the Japanese practice whereby a samurai, when they lost honor, the only way they can redeem themselves is to literally engage in self-disembowelment. That's the only way they can regain their honor. Well, I argue, regrettably, that the West suffers from civilizational seppuku.
And I'm a Mississippi yokel, so let me tell you how I think about this and maybe get your thoughts. But like at some level, you can tell looking at me, I'm a portly guy. I've had too much fried chicken and catfish in Mississippi. You'll get used to that when you're here. We have gone through this phase where the American mentality is not only, hey, we're not going to be rude, right? So if I walk out in the street, it would be very rare for somebody to walk up and be like, dude, you're fat. Right. But we've gone from, hey, don't be rude, to actually let's celebrate something, right? This whole fat positivity thing, right? And at some level, we're actually celebrating things that are harmful to people because we don't want to be rude or we want to be accepting. You talked about the other day on X, and you've got 1.2 million followers on X. It's incredible. But you talked about this the other day, that if you look at instances of self-reported mental health disorders, that across the political spectrum, you see this huge slide from the far left to the far right, where the far left is now indicating mental health, self-identifying mental health at plus 60%. so that we went from let's not stigmatize mental health problems to literally kind of let's celebrate it. Let's talk about how brave we are for wallowing in our self-misery. And it just strikes me as counterproductive to the fabric of society.
Perfectly stated. And as a matter of fact, in this book, which is the book between these two, this one came out in 2023, The Sad Truth About Happiness. To your point about that figure that you're talking about, political orientation and correlating that with mental health issues. In the book, I talk about this unequivocal finding that has been repeatedly reported by many researchers showing that political orientation and happiness scores, to some extent, you can argue that happiness is sort of the opposite side of the coin of suffering from, say, depression, right? Well, it might not surprise your lovely listeners in Mississippi. More conservative I am, the higher my happier score. More progressive I am, the lower my happier score. And I think I have a plausible explanation for that. Maybe you could tell me what you think of it. So I argue that the conservative person wakes up in the morning filled with gratitude. I live in a free society. I have freedom of speech. I have freedom of conscience. I have freedom of assembly. It may not be a perfect society, but out of the full panoply of societies, I am really grateful to be here. I'm grateful to be in Oxford, Mississippi. It's a beautiful place. Therefore, sure, I could change things, but I'm happy. On the other hand, the progressive wakes up in the morning and says, I live on stolen land. I live in an Islamophobic, transphobic, misogynistic society. I've committed genocide against the indigenous people. I'm a terrible person, and so on. So I'm self-flagellating. So here's an idea. Around the corner, if I could simply burn down the current society and socially engineer the new society, around the corner lies unicornia. So I can't be happy today. I'm filled with existential angst. I think that tells the same story as the finding that you talked about on X.
Is there a world in which, because you described positive motives or at least potentially good motives with some people who are like, hey, let's just tolerate everything. Let's not make anybody feel bad. Let's not confront people with truth. Is there an element that could actually be insidious about that? In that when I was in college, all these concepts were floating around. And the message was, hey, you just need to be more tolerant, more accepting, not question these things. But what I figured out was that those were people who were operating from positions of weakness with their social views. And now that some of those social views are no longer in positions of weakness, they're no longer interested in relativism and postmodernism.
Right. Absolutely. And I mean, there are many downstream effects, both in the quality and flourishing of your personal life and at the civilizational level, where bad ideas will have negative consequences. Let's take an example. If, for example, I believe that I don't have personal agency. In other words, I'm not the architect of my life's trajectory. Then that will completely alter the way that I interact with feedback from the world. So, for example, there's something called in psychology called the self-serving bias, which is I attribute successes internally and I attribute failures externally, right? So I did well on the exam because I'm a smart person and I studied hard. I did poorly on the exam because Professor Saad is a mean bastard, okay? And for many people, that makes perfect sense. It's an ego defensive strategy. But if that mechanism hyper fires so that all of my faults, all of my failures are always blamed on external agents, I could never learn from my mistakes, right? So if I am a budding entrepreneur and every time that I start a new venture, it always fails, and my conclusion is always it's because the customer is an idiot, it's because they don't understand what a visionary I am, then I'm never going to be able to identify some things that I might be systemically doing across all of these ventures. So bad thought processes are not just things that we discuss in the ivory tower. Bad ideas have bad consequences. Good ideas result in the flourishing of the individual and civilization.
So I wish I was Rogan and had 3 hours with you, because there's a lot of stuff that I'd like to really get in depth with you. One of the things that I'll ask you quickly is you've been portrayed by some as being Islamophobic, from Lebanon, obviously experience and understanding the Middle East. How do you respond to those charges?
Of course, it's idiotic. Islam is a set of codified principles. Those principles are not an individual. Just like I could look at communism and say, does communism result in the maximal possible flourishing of individuals in a society? And I could answer yes or no. Islam has certain principles. Those principles are either congruent with Western values, with American freedoms, or they're not. Well, I'm here to tell you that the most foundational tenets of Islam couldn't be any more incongruent with American foundational values. That doesn't mean that I think that individual Muslims may not be as lovely as anybody else, as peaceful as anybody else. They are part of the same normal distribution as any other grouping. There are nice Jews and mean Jews. There are nice Christians and mean Christians. But Islam is a codified set of principles. Depending on whether we think those principles are congruent with our values, should decide, for example, the extent to which we open our societies to Islamic immigration. So I reject that appellation. It's silly and imbecilic.
Yeah, I think it's important, at least from my vantage point, to recognize that not all cultures are equally valid. There are cultures that produce better outcomes than other cultures. You are coming to Mississippi. Do you want to speak about that briefly and when the book is coming out?
Right. So the book will be out on May 12th. So in a few Tuesdays from now. It's actually really quite important if people are interested in buying the book to pre-order it, because what happens with the pre-orders is that they are accumulated so that on day one of the release, they all count as sales. So then you quickly can hit the bestsellers list and then it becomes sort of an avalanche. So if you're interested in the book, please pre-order it ASAP. I am coming to Ole Miss. I wanted to specifically have the pre-launch of the book in Mississippi as a honor and as a tip of the hat to beautiful Oxford.
Dr. Saad, thank you for joining us today. The Sit Down is a production of Mississippi Public Broadcasting Think Radio, made possible thanks to generous supports from listeners just like you. If you enjoy the guests and sit-downs we bring each week, please consider contributing to help keep this show and shows like this on air. Visit mpbonline.org or show your support using the MPB Public Media app. Today's show was produced by Jermaine Flood, live stream production by Abram Nanny. Thanks to our guest, Dr. Gad Saad. I'm Russell Tino. Join us here next week on Wednesday for a new episode of The Sit Down, heard only on MPB Think Radio.